Welcome, deeply curious listeners, to another deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that, well, frankly, it shapes almost every headline, every border dispute, every, fervent declaration of identity you see around the globe. We're talking about nationalism. Why do we feel this incredibly strong, almost innate connection to these abstract things we call nations? And where did this powerful, often violent idea even come from? We sort of take it for granted, don't we? Like breathing. But what if the answer to its origins, according to one truly brilliant and provocative thinker, might completely surprise you? What if it's not nearly as ancient or as natural as we often assume? What if it's something we made?
Indeed. And our central figure for today's deep dive is the late, great Ernest Gellner and his groundbreaking, really transformative work, Nations and Nationalism from 1983. This book is, well, it's widely acclaimed, praised as, and I quote, an incisive, penetrating, and persuasive discussion of how the nation-states of the modern industrial world differ from earlier states. Gellner was such a unique mind. His approach wasn't confined to just one academic box, cut across history, politics, economics, and maybe most importantly, philosophy and anthropology, to tackle the problem of nationalism simply as a problem. He didn't just see it as, say, a historical narrative or a political ideology to analyze. No, he saw it as a fundamental functional puzzle, something that demanded a totally new kind of explanation. He challenged pretty much every conventional understanding of the subject, forcing us to rethink its very foundations.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. Our mission today is to dive deep into Gellner's core arguments. We really want to understand precisely why he thought nationalism was a distinctly modern phenomenon and why he believed nations are, in fact, made, not born, which is, you have to admit, a truly surprising take. It turns a lot of our common assumptions completely on their head. We'll also explore his fascinating typology of nationalisms, looking at the different forms this powerful force can take across the globe, and ultimately what his ideas mean for our complex, interconnected world today. So get ready, because this is a deep dive that might just reshape how you perceive national identity and global conflicts.
It's definitely a perspective shift.
Right. So section 1, setting the stage. Ernest Gellner's radical approach. Let's start with Gellner himself. What made his perspective so revolutionary? As you mentioned, he didn't come at nationalism from the usual paths like sociology or history. His background was philosophy and anthropology. Now, was this just a quirk, or did it really give him a different angle?
Oh, absolutely the latter. It gave him a fresh, almost outsider's lens. It allowed him to propose ideas that maybe initially felt a bit unfashionable, but which ultimately proved profoundly insightful and, frankly, undeniable in their explanatory power. He wasn't tied to the established narratives of any single discipline you see, which meant he could forge entirely new connections and see things others, perhaps stuck in their disciplinary silos, simply missed.
Interesting. So what were the core insights from that background?
Well, as an anthropologist, Gellner was acutely aware of the radical differences between non-literate and literate, stateless, and state societies, fundamentally different ways of being organized. And he emphasized that these distinctions were primarily about organization and culture, crucially, not about race or genetics. He saw big historical changes, not as slow, gradual evolution, but as these profound transformations from one kind of organization and culture to another. That's a bold stance, right? It let him view modernity as this stark, almost revolutionary break from what came before, rather than just an extension of it.
Okay, a rupture, not a continuity. And the philosophy part.
As a philosopher, Gellner positioned himself firmly against both fundamentalism, the idea of one single absolute truth, and relativism, which basically denies any objective truth. He genuinely believed in the possibility of objective knowledge of the world transcending social and cultural differences. And he thought we get there primarily through Enlightenment rationality and natural science. But here's what's truly fascinating, and maybe a bit counterintuitive. His view on dominant ideas in society. He argued they're often banal and unreflective, ideas we just accept without really thinking. And quite controversially, he proposed that false ideas could often more effectively generate social solidarity than true ones.
Wow, hang on. False ideas can bind people better than true ones.
That's what he argued. Think about it. A compelling, unifying narrative, even if it's not strictly accurate, can sometimes be more powerful for social cohesion than the complicated, messy truth. And this leads directly to his crucial point about nationalism. Nationalist thought wasn't important because it was novel or illuminating or rational. Its intellectual merit, secondary. It was fundamentally a product of specific, underlying social conditions, not some intellectual masterpiece that won people over by sheer brilliance. It served a function.
So if Gellner's saying nationalism isn't necessarily this great philosophy, but more like a tool or a necessary byproduct, what does that mean for how we understand it? It sounds like he was really swimming against the current, totally at odds with everyone who came before him. Before Gellner, the thinking on nationalism took a few different shapes, right?
Absolutely. Before him, scholars mostly approached it as an ideology or a historical phase. You had Carlton J. Hayes back in 1931 seeing nationalism as an ism, a political philosophy. He thought it was trying to revive primitive tribalism on an artificial scale, mostly born in the 18th century, a conscious doctrine people chose.
An ism.
Then there was Hans Kohn, whose big work came out in 1944, The Idea of Nationalism. Kohn also treated it as an idea or doctrine, but he connected it more to specific national histories. He famously distinguished between Western nationalism, civic, liberal, democratic, forming within existing states, and Eastern nationalism, ethnic, focused on language groups, emerging within multinational empires. You can really see Kohn's perspective being shaped by World War II, can't you? Pitting the UK and USA against Germany, Italy, Japan.
Yeah, that makes sense given the time.
And interestingly, after 1945, there was even this sense kind of captured by E.H. Carr's Nationalism and After, that maybe the subject itself was becoming historical, almost a problem solved or fading away.
So these earlier guys saw it as a philosophy, an idea, maybe something from history. But Gellner, you're saying, takes a completely different tack.
A sharp, decisive break.
Absolutely.
Gellner utterly rejected the idea that nationalism was just an aspect of national history or feeling or some irrational doctrine to be praised or condemned. For him, modernity wasn't gradual evolution. It was a profound rupture with earlier social orders. And crucially, nationalism wasn't an idea that caused this rupture. No, it was a fundamental function of this new modernity itself, something that emerged out of necessity, a structural requirement of a new kind of society.
A function.
He also really disagreed with Marxists who saw capitalism or class as the central feature, or thought class conflict would lead inevitably to socialism. Gellner kind of inverted that. He prioritized social organization over abstract ideas. Nationalism, he argued, was a product, not a producer, of modernity. Its overwhelming success wasn't because it was intellectually brilliant or because its leaders were charismatic geniuses. It was successful because of its indispensable function within this new industrial landscape. It did something essential that nothing else could.
Wow, okay. That's a huge reframing. So if nationalism wasn't really about nations waking up or classes fighting or intellectuals convincing people, then how is it to be understood? It sounds like Gellner had to go right back to basics, almost define a whole new type of society to explain this thing.
Exactly. That was his central challenge. He had to figure out what is the defining feature of modernity, and then show how nationalism is absolutely functional for it. What was this fundamental force that needed nationalism to exist? And that's what he set out to explain through this big, sweeping historical analysis, showing us that nations aren't some ancient truth, but a very modern invention.
All right, let's get into that. Section 2. 3 eras of humanity, from hunter-gatherers to industrial society. So Gellner lays this groundwork, this grand historical framework. Mankind passes through 3 big stages: pre-agrarian, agrarian, and industrial. And each one has a totally different relationship with the idea of a nation, right?
Precisely. This framework is where he grounds the whole theory. Let's start with the first stage. Pre-agrarian societies. Hunter-gatherers, basically. These groups were simply too small, he says, to allow the kind of political division of labor which constitutes the state. No central authority, no specialized rule enforcers, and without a state, Gellner argues, the problem of nationalism does not arise for stateless societies. The whole idea of aligning a culture with a political unit is not relevant. There's no political unit like that to align with.
Makes sense. No state, no nationalism. What about the next stage?
Stage 2, agrarian societies. Now this is a massive leap. Settled agriculture, bigger populations, villages, towns, sometimes huge empires. But crucially, these societies still largely operated without nations as we understand them today. Most, though not all, were state-endowed. Gellner uses Weber's definition of the state having a monopoly of legitimate violence, but he refines it a bit. He notes exceptions, like feudal states allowing private wars, or tribes raiding as long as they reported it. For Gellner, the key is that the state is the specialization and concentration of order maintenance. Some people specialize in keeping order, and that's the state.
Okay, so states exist, but still no nations. Why not?
Because, and this is critical in agrarian societies, there was no nation-state congruence. Almost everything, Gellner writes, in agro-literate society militates against the definition of political units in terms of cultural boundaries. Think about it. You had city-states, little principalities, Massive multi-ethnic empires like the Ottomans or the Habsburgs, their borders almost never lined up neatly with a single culture or language group. That wasn't the point.
So what held them together? What was identity based on?
Instead of cultural unity, you saw immense cultural proliferation and vertical cleavage. Gellner talks about wild cultures, meaning they just reproduce spontaneously, like wildflowers, no central planning. Your identity was based on fixed social structures. You were a priest, a blacksmith, a peasant, a noble. Your place was defined by your role and your very local community, your village, your kin. There was actually great stress on cultural differentiation within society. It reinforced the hierarchy. The ruling elite might speak a totally different language, have different customs, claim different origins than the peasants they ruled. And this wasn't seen as a problem, it was just how things were. He mentions 19th century Tunisia, where the rulers called themselves Turkish, even though they didn't speak Turkish. Local cultures, peasant dialects, they were almost invisible politically. They marked where you were from, but they didn't imply any claim to power.
What about religion? Didn't that provide a broader identity?
Yes. The role of the clerisy or high cultures was important. Big scriptural world religions, Christianity, Islam, and their priestly castes did provide overarching identities that crossed political borders. Think of the Latin-speaking clergy across medieval Europe, or the Muslim ulama across the Islamic world. But, and this is key, these high cultures couldn't be universalized to the masses. Why? Fundamentally, lack of means. Mass literacy was impossible. High culture was an elite thing, often inaccessible and mysterious to the common person. It was revered, maybe, but not widely practiced. It was more like a shared code among the elite than a lived reality for everyone.
Right. So if you were a peasant back then, your world was small. Your identity was your village, your family, your local lord, maybe your religion in a general sense, but not French or German in the way we think of it now. The idea of a shared culture defining a political unit just wasn't really there, and it wasn't an accident. It was baked into the structure.
Right.
But then something massive changed all that.
Exactly. Then we arrive at the Industrial Revolution. And for Gellner, this is the absolute catalyst, the game changer. He sees modernity not just as a different economy, but as a distinctive form of social organization and culture. And nationalism, it's an inherent function of modernity, not just correlated, but a deep functional necessity for this new industrial society to even work.
Okay, so what's the driving force here? What's so different about industrial society?
The economic impetus. Industrial society is unique because it's based on sustained and perpetual growth. This isn't optional, it's fundamental. Constant growth needs constant innovation. And innovation means a changing occupational structure. Jobs appear, disappear, transform. What does that mean for people? It means they must be ready for reallocation to new tasks. They need mobility, adaptability. They need to be able to shift jobs, maybe multiple times. Think about careers today versus, say, being a farmer for life. That constant churn needs flexible people.
Okay, mobility. How does that connect to nationalism?
It leads directly to the new role of work and communication. Work itself changes. It shifts dramatically from mostly manipulation of things, like plowing, weaving, to manipulation of meanings. Most jobs now involve exchanging communications with other people or manipulating the controls of a machine. Think offices, factories, operating complex equipment. This fundamentally demands explicit and reasonably precise communication between strangers, often in a standard idiom. The old ways, gestures, tone, shared local understanding in a village just aren't enough anymore. You need to understand written instructions, manuals, abstract rules. You need to communicate clearly with people you've never met, maybe far away. You need a common language for work, commerce, bureaucracy.
A standard way of communicating, which implies a standard culture.
Precisely. This brings us to the rise of universal high culture. For this new communication to work, literacy is vital. Not just for an elite, but for the general population. You need it for specific jobs and for this new context-free communication. But how do you get mass literacy? This is where the state becomes absolutely indispensable. Mass literacy in a standardized written vernacular can only be provided by mass education, which only the state is capable of underwriting, if not directly supplying. So education becomes the state's top priority. It's not just about keeping order anymore. It's about producing a functionally literate, culturally homogeneous workforce.
Wow. So the state's role fundamentally shifts.
Massively. Gellner's argument here is truly radical. The state becomes the indispensable keeper and protector of this national educational and communication system. And in a dramatic flip, he argues, at the base of the modern social order stands not the executioner, but the professor. Think about that. Not the guillotine, but the aptly named doctorat d'état is the main tool and symbol of state power. You goes on, the monopoly of legitimate education is now more important, more central than is the monopoly of legitimate violence.
That's incredible. Education as the main tool of state power, more than the police or army.
That's his argument. The ability to educate, to standardize thought and language, becomes the crucial instrument. It ensures the production of viable and usable human beings for the industrial machine. He uses this powerful aquarium analogy. Industrial man, Gellner says, can no longer breathe effectively in the nature-given atmosphere, those old local folk cultures, but can only function effectively and survive in a new, specially blended and artificially sustained air or medium. These breathing chambers are the national cultural and educational systems maintained by the state. Individuals get socialized into this shared, standardized high culture from birth. It provides the common language, the shared concepts needed for mobility. They literally can't function without this cultural air.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. Industrial society needs people who are basically interchangeable parts. People who can move between jobs, communicate precisely with anyone, anywhere in that society. And this forces a massive cultural standardization. It forces the creation of what Gellner calls a high culture, this universal school-taught language and set of skills, which was impossible and frankly unnecessary before industry. So that feeling we have, that sense that national identity is natural, that everyone in a country should share a language and culture. For Gellner, that's just an expression of this irresistible convergence of state, population, and culture that industry demands. It's a functional requirement, dressed up as something natural. This is the making of nations he's talking about.
You got it. It's not ancient destiny, it's a modern necessity.
Okay, Section 3, the spark of conflict. How nationalism erupts. This is a crucial pivot point for me. If industrialism pushes towards this cultural homogeneity, creating these national aquariums, how does that lead to conflict? To the fierce rivalries, the violent separations we associate with nationalism? It seems almost paradoxical.
That's a great question. If everyone's supposed to become the same, where does the conflict come from? And that's where Gellner introduces the critical factor of uneven development. The problem is, industrialization doesn't spread like a nice even layer of butter. It hits different regions, different groups within a society, at different times and speeds. It creates, as Gellner puts it, septic inequalities. So more backward groups and regions are disadvantaged in relation to those who are further forward. They find themselves stuck at the bottom of this new social hierarchy. They can't get the good jobs, access the opportunities, because they lack the skills, the language, the high culture of the dominant industrialized group.
Okay, so inequality arises from uneven modernization. How does culture play into that?
This is where pre-existing cultural differences become absolutely explosive. If there are visible differences already there, maybe language, religion, skin color, anything that marks a group out this age, the better placed, more advanced groups have a powerful incentive to use these diacritical marks, as Gellner calls them, to restrict competition. They can basically use these cultural markers to keep the disadvantaged group out of the good jobs, the good schools, the levers of power. Think of a factory owner only hiring people who speak his language, or subtle biases in the system.
Right. So the successful group uses culture to protect its position. What about the disadvantaged group?
Well, their response is often to use such distinctions to justify and motivate the goal of political autonomy. They see that the existing state, dominated by the other culture, isn't working for them. So their aim becomes creating a new state, their own state, where their language and their people dominate the system. A state that ensures fair access and opportunity for their own members, promotes their national interest. This creates that powerful drive for separation, for self-determination.
And this often involves intellectuals leading the charge.
Yes, this dynamic leads to what Gellner calls an alliance between a culturally identifying intelligentsia, think journalists, teachers, professors, people who are often educated in the dominant culture but still identify with their folk roots in the proletariat or the mass of disadvantaged workers. The intellectuals provide the coherent narrative, the historical myths, the standardized language. They basically elevate the folk culture into a potential new high culture. And the masses provide the popular support, driven by very real grievances about jobs, discrimination, lack of opportunity.
Okay, so this is where nationalism shifts. It's not just about unifying people who already share a culture, like turning peasants into Frenchmen. It becomes this force for conflict and separation. Like a new group, say, the Ruritanians wanted to carve out Ruritania from a larger empire. Gellner's fictional case study of Ruritania really illustrates this, doesn't it?
It really does. He paints this picture. You have Ruritanian peasants speaking their local dialects, living their traditional lives, mostly ignored by the big megalomanian empire. But then industry starts booming in megalomanious cities. These peasants are drawn in for work, but they're immediately at a disadvantage. They don't speak the dominant megalomanian language, the language of the factories, the bureaucracy. Their Ruritanian dialect is useless. So they end up in the worst jobs, facing discrimination, feeling alienated. But then some educated Ruritanian youth, maybe they went to university in the capital, maybe studied abroad, they come back. And they realize that this cultural difference, which was a handicap, can actually become a unifying banner. They start collecting folk songs, writing histories, standardizing the Ruritanian language, effectively inventing a Ruritanian high culture. This fuels passionate calls for their own state, their own aquarium, where Ruritanian is the language of power and opportunity. It's a powerful narrative, even if, as Gellner points out, the original folk songs probably didn't mention nationalism at all. The spark is that economic disadvantage, made visible, made potent by cultural difference.
That makes the dynamic much clearer. Now, you also mentioned Gellner talks about social entropy. How does that fit in?
Right. Building on this, Gellner introduces this really crucial concept of social entropy in industrial society. The ideal of industrial society, because it needs mobility and meritocracy, is to have random-seeming entropic mobility. Think of entropy in physics, a tendency towards randomness and disorder. Socially, he means individuals should be able to move freely, be distributed randomly throughout society. Status should be based purely on talent and achievement, not on fixed social categories like birth or ethnicity, like a perfectly mixed liquid where every molecule can move anywhere. That's the ideal for an efficient industrial system.
Okay, perfect mixing. But reality isn't like that.
Exactly. Because some attributes can be entropy-resistant traits. These are attributes that have a marked tendency not to become evenly dispersed throughout the entire society.
Yeah.
If people with a certain trait, let's use Gellner's hypothetical example of blueness, maybe having blue skin or consistently stuck at the top or more often stuck at the bottom, then it constitutes a very serious problem for industrial society. Why? Because this visible, persistent link between a trait and social disadvantage or privilege fundamentally contradicts the ideal of an open, fluid, meritocratic system. It's like a blockage, a clog in the industrial machine.
And this is different from older societies.
Completely different. This is a crucial distinction from agrarian society. Agrarian societies, far from hating such traits, often invented them. Think divine right of kings or caste systems. They created fixed categories to legitimize rigid hierarchies. Difference was useful for maintaining order. But industrial society, with its ideal of la carrière ouverte au talent, careers open to talents, finds these persistent, visible inequalities deeply problematic. They obstruct the smooth functioning of the mobile, atomized society it wants to create.
So what kinds of traits are entropy resistant?
Gellner points to a couple of main types. Genetic traits are obvious things like pigmentation, Gellner's blueness, or real-world examples like skin color, or even physical height differences that historically correlated with ethnicity and status, like in Rwanda and Burundi. These are incredibly hard or impossible to just shed. Assimilation isn't really an option, and he really emphasizes his deep cultural or religious habits can possess a vigor and tenacity which can virtually equal those which are rooted in our genetic constitution.
Wait, cultural habits as strong as genetics?
Virtually, yes. He argues that while things like language and formal religious doctrines can, maybe surprisingly, be easier to change over time, these deeply ingrained, almost unconscious cultural practices, specific social manners, food habits, humor, ways of thinking, family structures are profoundly resistant to change. They mark you out. He gives the example of the impassable fissure between Algerian Kabyle peasants and French peasants, even when Algeria was legally France. It wasn't language necessarily, but deep cultural habits creating a social chasm. Or the conflict in Ulster, not just about communication, but about a cultural identification so firm as to be comparable to some physical characteristic. A really fascinating case he mentions is the ex-Muslim Bosnians in former Yugoslavia. They fought hard to be able to identify as Muslim nationality on the census, not because they were necessarily practicing religion, but because their lapsed faith, their shared history and cultural background tied to Islam, defined their distinct ethnic group, setting them apart from Orthodox Serbs or Catholic Croats, even though they spoke the same language. It shows how cultural identity, even based on something historical like a past religion, can become an incredibly powerful, indelible, entropy-resistant trait. It defines who you are and who you aren't in the modern world.
That's fascinating and crucial, because while our fictional Ruritanian migrant might, in theory, eventually assimilate by learning the megalomanian language and culture, someone with blueness, or these deep cultural markers, cannot just shed that identity. And that creates huge tension. If industrial society ideally wants fluidity and equal opportunity, these entropy-resistant traits become flashpoints for intense conflict, discrimination, resentment. So this is where groups face that stark choice. Try painful, maybe impossible assimilation, or fight for their own aquarium, their own state, where their trait, their culture is the norm, not a liability. It explains the desperation behind some nationalist movements.
Precisely. It turns cultural difference from a mere variation into a major political problem.
Okay, let's move to section 4, types of nationalist experience. Gellner creates a kind of sociological typology, right? Using his model to explain why different nationalisms look so different.
Yes, his abstract model, based on those core factors, proves remarkably useful here. It helps map out the different scenarios and why they lead to different outcomes.
Can you remind us of the core factors he uses?
Sure. He boils it down to 3 crucial factors that shape the nationalist experience during industrialization. First, power. P. Simple enough. In modern industrial society, power is always unequal. You have power holders and the rest. Second, access to education. E. Meaning that modern high culture, those skills needed to function. Here it's more complex. Access can be equal, unequal favoring the powerful, unequal favoring the powerless, less common, or equally lacking for both. This syndrome of skills is key for jobs and mobility. Third, cultural unity, A versus duality, AB. Is the society basically monocultural, everyone shares culture A, or are there 2 distinct cultures? Power holders have A, the rest have B.
Okay, power, education access, and cultural unituality, PEAB.
Right. And when you combine these Gellner figures, you get 8 possible situations. But, and this is important, he argues only 3 of these situations actually generate nationalism as we recognize it. The situations where everyone basically shares the same culture already, cultural homogeneity, they don't produce nationalism as a distinct force. You might get other conflicts, like class conflict. But class conflict alone, Gellner argues, doesn't escalate indefinitely unless cultural differentiation provides the spark. You need that cultural us versus them line for nationalism to really ignite.
So cultural difference plus inequality is the essential fuel. What are the 3 main types of nationalism that emerge from this?
Okay, the first type he identifies is classical Habsburg or Eastern nationalism. This is the classic scenario we touched on with Ruritania. The situation is power holders, P, have privileged access, plus E, to the central high culture A, which is usually their own, like German in the Habsburg Empire. Meanwhile, the powerless are education deprived, E, and belong to distinct folk cultures, B. The dynamic is potent, intellectuals emerge from the B culture, they work energetically to transform their folk culture into a rival, new high culture, often inventing traditions, standardizing language. They mobilize the disadvantaged masses, promising access and dignity in their own state. The outcome, often fierce rivalry. It frequently leads to very forceful cultural engineering. Think brutal population exchanges, expulsions, forced assimilation, sometimes even liquidation, all to achieve that congruence of state and culture. Ruritania is his caricature, but it reflects movements across Central and Eastern Europe. The Balkans, what Plaminats called the Eastern type.
Okay, that's the conflict-driven, empire-breaking type. What's the second?
The second type is Western or unificatory nationalism. Here, this setup is quite different. The scenario. Power holders, P, and the rest, AP, already largely share the same high culture, A, and have relatively equal access to education. The core issue isn't cultural division, it's political fragmentation. Imagine a region where everyone speaks Italian or German, shares a literary tradition, but they're split into dozens of little states or kingdoms. The dynamic here is about unification. The goal is to bring these existing, well-defined high cultures, which already have a well-defined folk clientele, under one single political roof. The outcome, as Plaminats noted, tends to be less brutal. It usually requires a bit of adjustment in the political situation and in the international boundaries, not massive ethnic cleansing. Plaminats saw this type as relatively benign and nice. Think Italian Risorgimento, German unification in the 19th century.
Right, uniting people who already feel culturally linked. And the third type?
The third is diaspora nationalism. This one is particularly fascinating and often quite tragic. The situation, power holders, P, have their own culture. A, and access to education, easy, but the powerless group, P, is culturally distinct. B, but they also have access to education. Plus E, these are often economically successful urban specialists, think financiers, traders, artisans, intellectuals who lack political power, and crucially, a compact territorial base. They're a scattered minority.
Why would they have education but no power?
Historically, in agrarian societies, Gellner talks about pariah bureaucracies, groups like eunuchs, priests, slaves, often foreigners who performed essential but sometimes dangerous administrative or financial jobs. They were trusted because they were excluded from local power struggles, had no kin ties. They filled vital economic niches. Modernization blows this system up. These skilled, mobile minorities often thrive initially in the new industrial order. Their literacy, numeracy, commercial skills fit well. But they lose their traditional protection and monopolies. Their economic success, combined with being culturally distinct and politically weak, makes them incredibly vulnerable scapegoats, especially when the majority feels threatened by industrial change. States might find it politically useful to deprive the minority of its economic monopolies and dispossess and persecute it to appease the majority. The outcome for these groups, it can range from genocide to expulsion if they can't assimilate, which is often hard due to visible markers, or, crucially, acquire their own state. Think of the historical fates of Jews, Greeks, Armenians, Parsis, or more recently, overseas Chinese, Indians, or the Igbos in Nigeria. Their need for a state becomes a matter of sheer survival.
That really highlights the vulnerability. Successful but powerless. And you mentioned the most famous example earlier, Israel. Gellner saw that as the ultimate diaspora nationalism.
Yes, he describes Israel as the most famous and dramatic case of a successful diaspora nationalism. Here you had a people, the Jews, dispersed for nearly 2,000 years without a territorial base. Their drive for statehood was powerfully fueled by persecution, especially the Holocaust, which starkly showed the danger for distinct, economically visible but politically defenseless groups in the modern world. Never again became a driving force, and creating Israel required this extraordinary transformation Gellner talks about. An urban, highly literate and sophisticated cosmopolitan population had to essentially return to the land, become surrogate peasants in the kibbutzim. These communal settlements were revolutionary, both productive and military units, essential for building and defending a state in a hostile region. This massive internal change, going against the grain of urbanization, needed a powerful ideology, a mix of socialism and populism, to bind people together and achieve that territorial goal. It's a testament to the incredible power of nationalism when survival is at stake.
A unique and dramatic case, for sure. What about nationalism outside Europe? Gellner talks about Africa having a distinct pattern.
He does. He discusses African nationalism as a kind of counter-entropic type. A key factor is the colonial legacy. European powers drew borders with total disregard for local ethnic realities, creating multi-ethnic states often defined by arbitrary lines on the map. Now, these European colonial administrations were paradigmatically counter-entropic. What he means is they deliberately created a system resisting that ideal of random mobility. The hierarchy was stark and visible. Rulers were white, everyone else was black. Simple, easy to read, based on color. In an old agrarian society, such divisions might have created a kind of stability. But industrial society, Gellner insists, is profoundly allergic to counter-entropic institutions. It hates fixed categories blocking mobility. So the basis of African nationalism wasn't typically labor migrants maltreated at the factory gate by foremen speaking a different language, like in Europe. Instead, Gellner argues it was often driven by intellectuals capable of fluent communication in the colonial language, but debarred as a category from positions of real power by a shared distinctive trait. They were united not by a shared indigenous culture, but by shared exclusion within the arbitrary colonial unit. Their common experience was being blocked by the color bar.
So the shared enemy, the colonial power, created the unity.
To a large extent, yes. And after post-independence, it's striking how stable those artificial colonial frontiers have mostly remained. Few attempts to redraw borders along ethnic lines succeeded, and colonial languages often persist as the language of government and education. Why? Partly because of the sheer linguistic fragmentation within many African states. Choosing one indigenous language as the national language would alienate all the others. Sometimes the colonial language is the only viable shared high culture, however problematic that is. Though some nations like Algeria with Arabization did try costly cultural transformations. However, religious advantage did play a role. Groups linked to a literate high culture through Islam or Christianity were often better equipped to develop an effective nationalism. Think Somalis or Amharas in the Horn of Africa both had traditions of literacy and statehood, gun and book, that helped forge a stronger national identity. And he mentioned Somali and Kurdish nationalism as interesting cases, blending old tribalism based on social structure with the new anonymous nationalism based on shared culture. While internal tribal loyalties might remain, the overarching shared culture, if it gets its own state, offers access to jobs and psychic comfort. It shows how even older structures can adapt within the modern nationalist framework.
Okay, that typology is really helpful for seeing the different paths nationalism can take. Let's move to section V. The deception and reality of nationalism. This is where Gellner gets really provocative, isn't it? If nations aren't just waking up, if nationalism is actively creating them, transforming cultures, even inventing traditions. What does that say about how nationalism presents itself? He argues there's a big self-deception going on.
Oh, absolutely. A profound one. The core deception of nationalism, Gellner argues, is this. It claims to defend and revive folk cultures, asserting this deep, unbroken link to the past. We're just restoring what was always ours, it says. But in reality, what it defends and revives are often its own inventions, or are modified out of all recognition. Nationalism is essentially the general imposition of a high culture on society. It takes those diverse local folk cultures and replaces them with a single, standardized, school-taught idiom suitable for a modern state.
So it uses the symbols of the past, but creates something new.
Exactly. Its symbolism often draws from the healthy, pristine, vigorous life of the peasants, of the Volk, the Narod. It projects this image of authentic ancient roots. But the reality is starkly different. If the nationalism prospers, it eliminates the alien high culture, but it does not then replace it by the old local low culture. It revives or invents a local high, literate, specialist transmitted culture of its own. Think of his examples. Great ladies at the Budapest Opera who really went to town in peasant dresses, or urban Soviets listening to ethnic records. These aren't peasants living their culture, they're educated city dwellers consuming a stylized, invented heritage that serves the new national high culture. The folk is celebrated, yes, but only after being cleaned up, standardized, and made useful for the modern state.
A kind of romanticized, curated past.
Precisely. And the ultimate aim is this transformation of identity. Nationalism wants an anonymous, impersonal society with mutually substitutable, atomized individuals, held together above all by a shared culture of this kind. It replaces those complex, local group identities of agrarian society, village, craft, family, with membership in this broad, homogeneous cultural unit. You become French or German or Ruritanian first and foremost. Interchangeable parts in the industrial machine, all speaking the same language, sharing the same basic skills, breathing that same aquarium air. And this leads directly to the pervasive myth of natural nations. Nationalism insists that nations are there in the very nature of things, only waiting to be awakened. Like sleeping giants, Gellner is blunt. Nations as a natural God-given way of classifying men as an inherent though long-delayed political destiny are a myth. They are powerful artifacts of modern social forces. They are made, not found.
Okay, that's a powerful critique, but it raises that big question again. If it's so deceptive, based on this myth, why is it so incredibly powerful? It can't just be a trick. As Gellner himself notes, if it were just an idea, plenty of others with more intellectual merit should have won out. So what gives it this undeniable force?
You're right, it's not just a clever lie. Despite its false consciousness, nationalism is a very strong force, precisely because it's rooted in the profound social changes of modernity. It's a functional necessity, not just a preference. It does a vital job nothing else can.
And the key is communication again.
Yes, communication is central. Gellner argues it is the media themselves, the pervasiveness and importance of abstract, centralized, standardized, one-to-many communication, which itself automatically engenders the core idea of nationalism, quite irrespective of what in particular is being put into the specific messages transmitted. It's almost McLuhan-esque. The medium is the message, the very structure of modern communication needing a shared standard idiom for mass media, bureaucracy, education, creates the conditions for nationalism. If you can't understand the language of the TV, the newspaper, the government forms, you are simply excluded.
So the medium itself sends a message about inclusion and exclusion.
Exactly. The core message generated by this modern communication system is this: that the language and style of the transmissions is important, that only he who can understand them or can acquire such comprehension is included in a moral and economic community, and that he who does not and cannot is excluded. This is a stark, functional reality of industrial life. If you can't operate within the shared high culture, you're sidelined economically and socially. It's not about choosing a language preference, it's about survival, opportunity, participation.
And this changes the fundamental political questions people ask.
Fundamentally. Gellner brilliantly contrasts Eli Kaduri's hypothetical agrarian burgher. When this burgher hears about a new pasha, a new ruler, what's his main concern? Is the pasha less corrupt and grasping or more just and merciful? End quote. If a burgher's wife asked about the pasha's home idiom, his native language, it would seem insane, completely irrelevant. But in the modern world, that seemingly mad question about the ruler's language becomes absolutely central. It's the crucial sign as to whom the new power will favor and whom it will exclude. Why? Because the economy requires that society hide communication, and the state's main job is maintaining the cultural infrastructure for it. The ruler's culture now directly impacts everyone's access to jobs, education, opportunity. It's not about morality anymore, it's about cultural alignment.
Wow. So it's not about people suddenly becoming inherently nicer or nastier, as some dark god's view might suggest, like some ancient tribal savagery just bubbling up again. Gellner's saying our modern crimes are just more conspicuous because we have more powerful technological means to carry them out. The violence comes from the structural conflicts of this massive societal reorganization.
That's precisely it. Gellner ultimately emphasizes that nationalism is a necessity. It stems from the pulverization of traditional societies, the bursting open of self-sufficient economies by industrialism. It's the unavoidable reorganization of society that's compatible with modern productive methods. Old social bonds break down under mobility and mass communication, and nationalism fills the void, providing the new glue for a mobile modern society.
The new glue.
And this leads him to that powerful conclusion about nation classes, or class nations. He says, neither nations nor classes seem to be political catalysts. Only nation classes or class nations are such, meaning simply sharing a culture, being a nation, or sharing an economic status, being a class, isn't usually enough on its own to trigger massive political upheaval. Conflict becomes really virulent and decisively explosive only when cultural difference clays those entropy-resistant traits like language, religion, color lines up with septic inequalities in power and wealth. When a disadvantaged class can also see itself as a distinct cultural nation, that's when you get the truly revolutionary and often violent force of nationalism.
When culture and class grievances merge. Okay, section 6, the future. Muted but persistent nationalism. This framework is fascinating for understanding the past and present, but if nationalism is so tied to the industrial age, what happens as industrial societies mature? As they globalize, does it just fade away? Or take a different form? What were Gellner's predictions?
He offered some nuanced predictions, both hopeful and, well, realistic. He foresaw a future with both convergence and muting of nationalist passion. On one hand, he expected a certain measure of global cultural convergence, driven by shared industrial logic, science, global trade, increasing interdependence. We see this, right? International business, science, technology create shared languages and practices. Credit cards work everywhere. Technical manuals are universal. This shared operational culture can prevent communication gaps from exacerbating tension between the more and the less privileged, because there's a growing common conceptual currency.
So some global homogenization, does that mean nations disappear?
Not necessarily.
Because on the other hand, he also predicted persistent cultural distinction. Even with a similar economic base, he argued, differences between cultural styles of life and communication will remain large enough to require separate servicing, and hence distinct cultural political units, whether or not they will be wholly sovereign. So while we might understand each other better operationally, the desire for distinct cultural political units, countries managing their own cultural aquarium, will likely persist. People generally still prefer to be governed in their own language, have their culture fostered by their own state.
So we can understand each other, but still want our own cultural space. Right. He firmly rejected the extreme incommensurability thesis, the idea that cultures are totally separate universes, that we can never truly understand each other across cultural divides. He was skeptical that was ever true, even in the past, and certainly not now. He believed modern conditions, shared knowledge, communication mean we can and do transcend relativism. We can learn other high cultures, appreciate them, become fluent. We're less trapped in our local culture than our ancestors were. Therefore, he expected a less virulent form of nationalism in late industrial society. Why? Because many boundaries have already adjusted themselves to the boundaries of these cultures. The really violent phase of nation building, like 19th and early 20th century Europe, might be largely over. There aren't as many big multinational empires left to break up. The nationalist principle is now widely, if sometimes grudgingly, accepted.
Muted but not gone. Are there still danger zones?
Yes, he recognized continuing challenges. Those counterintropic traits, especially visible ones like race, will keep causing tension because they visibly contradict its overt egalitarianism. When mobility is blocked by characteristics people can't change, that remains one of the most serious and intractable problems for industrial society's ideals. So, while the big, violent redrawing of the world map might lessen, specific conflicts rooted in these persistent inequalities tied to entropy-resistant traits will likely continue to be sore spots.
So pulling it all together, Gellner's theory suggests that while maybe the most intense, violent phase of nation building recedes as societies mature, the fundamental need for distinct cultural political units shaped by our industrial way of life isn't going anywhere. It's not a historical phase we're growing out of, it's baked into modernity. Nationalism, maybe in a quieter form, is here to stay because the conditions that created it, mobility, mass communication, the need for a shared high culture, are still fundamental to how we live.
That's a very good summary of his outlook. It's an inherent concomitant of the modern world, as you said.
Okay, let's wrap up. Outro.
Well, to conclude, Ernest Gellner's work really remains, as many scholars agree, the single most important attempt to provide a theory of nationalism as a whole. It's a profound challenge. It challenges us to look past the flags and anthems, beyond the surface, to see that the nations we just accept as natural, as ancient, they aren't. They are the powerful, sometimes painful, sometimes deceptive results of a world utterly transformed by industry, by its need for growth, and by that resulting functional demand for a common, cultivated, state-managed culture. His sociological model across those three stages gives us a really robust way to understand this ongoing transformation.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? It means that when you encounter those passionate discussions about national identity or ethnic conflict or calls for self-determination erupting somewhere in the world, you can now view them through Gellner's incredibly powerful lens. You can see them not necessarily as some ancient hatreds, some mysterious dark gods bubbling up, but maybe as complex, perhaps even unavoidable responses to the deep functional demands of modern society. You can ask yourself, what high culture is being forged or defended here? Who benefits? Who is excluded? And how do those entropy-resistant traits, language, religion, color, deep cultural habits play into the tensions we're seeing? It's a profound shift in perspective, isn't it? One that, maybe uncomfortably, makes the world around us, with all its nationalist passions, feel quite a bit more intelligible. Join us next time on The Deep Dive as we continue to unravel the complex tapestry of our world.